It was the kind of theft you wouldn't expect to matter not in the grand scale of criminal enterprise anyway. No lives were lost, no fortunes were made, no alarms were triggered. But in a hushed Benedictine monastery on the edge of Lake Como, something sacred had been taken, and for the small circle of monks who lived there, it was as if the heart of the abbey had stopped beating. The missing item, a pair of 13th century wooden sandals, once believed to belong to Saint Anselm of Canterbury. The relic had been kept under lock and glass in the Sanctum Repositorii for nearly 400 years. It wasn't ornate. It didn't glitter. The sandals were cracked and misshapen with time, but it was what they represented, a link to humility, to sanctity, to the monk's spiritual forebears, that made them invaluable. You are probably wondering, how do two monks, bound by vows of poverty and silence, become suspects in an international theft? Let's begin on the morning of March 17, 1984, the day Brother Aurelio and Brother Matteo vanished. A cloister without closure. The monastery of Santa Lucia di Sola had survived centuries of earthquakes, wars, and regimes. Nestled between stone terraces and olive trees, it was a secluded, self-sustaining world, the kind that deliberately cut itself off from modernity. Brother Aurelio was 51, with wiry fingers and an encyclopedic knowledge of Latin texts. He'd been in the order since he was 17. Brother Matteo was younger, only 32, and had a quiet affection for woodworking, often fixing chairs, mending altarpieces, and restoring old tools. They weren't friends exactly. Monastic life wasn't built on camaraderie, but on silence, ritual, and submission to the divine office. Still, the other monks noted their increasing proximity, always paired during chores, tending to the chapel at the same hours, even occasionally laughing, though laughter was rare and discouraged. When the morning bell tolled and neither Aurelio nor Matteo appeared for matins, it was assumed they had overslept or were unwell. But their cells were empty, their sandals were gone, and most damningly, so were the saints. Locked doors, open questions. The glass case in the sanctum hadn't been smashed. The iron key was still on its hook in the prior's study. There was no sign of forced entry. The slippers had been carefully, even reverently, removed from their velvet backing. No damage, no mess. In the record books of the monastery, such an event had never occurred. Theft was inconceivable. Desertion was shameful but not unheard of. But theft and desertion, it was unthinkable. The local carabinieri were summoned, reluctantly. The monks didn't want scandal, but there was now a holy artifact missing, and under Italian law, relics, even those of uncertain origin, were considered protected cultural property. The monk who wasn't there. The investigation began with the only witnesses available, other monks. Brother Nicola had seen the two men walking toward the lower vineyards the day before. Matteo had a satchel. Aurelio had his prayer book. That was the last confirmed sighting. In the small stone workshop behind the cloister garden, police found Matteo's woodworking bench recently cleaned. Too clean. Wood dust and shavings were common, but now the bench had been wiped spotless, down to its joints. Inside Matteo's satchel, recovered days later in a village 11 kilometers south, was only a small iron file, a travel icon of Saint Joseph, and a strip of linen cloth. No relic, no identification. A curious letter. 1 week after the disappearance, the prior received a letter, postmarked from Lugano, Switzerland. "Forgive us, we are not lost from God. We are walking with Him in secret now. The saint's path was humble and we are following it." No signature, but the handwriting was unmistakably Aurelio's, the same slanted script that graced decades of transcribed homilies. Swiss authorities were contacted. Train station footage was reviewed. A grainy image showed two robed men boarding a regional train in Bellinzona. No further sightings were confirmed. Interpol issued no warrant. The Vatican did not publicly acknowledge the incident. and the slippers, those cracked wooden symbols of sacrifice, had disappeared into the unknown. Sacred or stolen? In 1987, an antiquities dealer in Marseille contacted an Italian journalist, claiming he'd seen holy footwear for sale at a private estate auction. The journalist passed the message along to Italian authorities. By the time investigators arrived, the trail was cold. No shoes, no monks. Back at the monastery, a new case was built, less ornate, more secure, but it stood empty. And every year, on March 17, the monks still light a candle for the wanderers. But here's the question: were Aurelio and Matteo criminals or pilgrims on a radical path of devotion? What would make two men of faith risk everything for a pair of broken sandals? Switzerland is not where you'd expect two runaway monks to go unnoticed, particularly not those in long black robes, walking in near silence with little more than a satchel and a blessing. Yet, after that brief image in Bellinzona's train station, Brother Aurelio and Brother Matteo dissolved into the Alps like morning fog. There were no credit cards, no digital records, only rumors, half-memories, and a few scribbled notes left behind like breadcrumbs. Investigators nicknamed the journey La Via d'Ombra, the shadow pilgrimage. It wasn't just the relic, it was the manner of the act. Monks, by nature, leave no footprints in the modern world, but when they do, they often walk closer to myth than man. 2. The letters begin. In the autumn of 1984, 6 months after the slippers vanished, a second letter arrived, this time postmarked from Prague, Czechoslovakia. He walked to distant lands, barefoot and unafraid. We have left the mountain but not the light. The monastery, fearing scandal, didn't report the letter immediately. But when a third note arrived from Vilnius, Lithuania, the following spring, and then a fourth from Minsk, the Italian police were notified again. The messages were never threatening, never confessional. Instead, they read like cryptic sermons, half parables written in Latin, Greek, and once even in Aramaic. They became known as the Epistles of the Slippers. 3. A man named Ratchid. A break, or rather, a sliver of one, came in 1986 from a priest named Father Ratchid Abadi, who served in a small Maronite parish in Istanbul. He told a visiting scholar from Florence that, years earlier, 2 Italian monks had visited his church late at night, asking to see the reliquary of Saint Charbel. They were gentle, Ratchid recalled. One of them spoke very old Arabic. He kissed the floor before he left. Ratchid couldn't recall their names, but one of them had a wooden rosary carved with olive pits, common in Italy, but rare in the Levant. It wasn't proof, but it added another dot on the map, and a pattern began to form. 4. Unlikely motives. Why would monks steal a relic? Most criminal motives fall into neat categories: money, revenge, escape. But this case was slippery, a blend of reverence, defiance, and something bordering on madness. One theory posited that Aurelio and Matteo believed the slippers were never meant to be entombed in glass, but returned to the earth, walked again. Some believed they were staging a sort of reenactment, retracing the imagined steps of St. Anselm's early missionary work. Another theory suggested cultism, that the monks were seduced by fringe theology or obscure mysticism, but there was no evidence of esotericism in either man's background. They hadn't withdrawn from God. They had withdrawn from the monastery, and that was more troubling. 5. The Saint Slippers resurface, sort of. In 1989, an article in a Polish Catholic newspaper made a curious claim. A group of worshippers in Lublin said they had received a visit from 2 men, one old, one younger, who bore a sandal belonging to a saint. The men had spoken only Latin and a little broken Polish. They gave no names. They simply left behind a sermon handwritten on vellum, titled in Calce Ambulat Humilitas, in the sandal walks humility. The sandal itself, never recovered, no photos, no records. The article was met with skepticism, but those familiar with Aurelio's theology noted similarities in phrasing, especially his love for obscure patristic metaphors. One phrase stood out: "The skin remembers the foot even after the bones have gone." That was something Aurelio had written decades earlier in a lecture. 6. Crossing into myth. The monks had now been missing for over 5 years. Their names began to fade from official records, but among certain religious and academic circles, they had become modern legends. Some called them the quiet apostates. Others referred to them as the barefoot saints. Pilgrims in northern Italy began leaving empty sandals at hilltop shrines, a silent nod to the vanished men. In 1991, a graffiti tag appeared in Avignon. "He walks still, A+M." Meanwhile, at Santa Lucia di Sola, their names were never spoken aloud. The new prior had the epistles locked away in the archives. A second set of relics, bones of an unnamed 12th century hermit, were installed in the sanctum, but no one came to see them. Faith, it seemed, did not follow replacement. 7. The Hermit of Myra. In 1992, a hiker near the ruins of ancient Myra in Turkey came upon a makeshift hut deep in the Taurus Mountains. Inside, they found a shrine made of driftwood and icons. No one was there, but scratched into the stone were 3 words in Greek: Anselmos humus pax. A cup of water, a frayed black robe, a broken sandal. Interpol investigated. Nothing conclusive. DNA testing was still rudimentary, but the traces of life, bread crumbs, candle wax, worn-out scripture hinted that someone had lived there recently. 8. The Vatican silence. By now, religious scholars had become interested. Some suspected a cover-up, that the Vatican knew more than it let on. Why hadn't they declared the slippers officially stolen? Why no papal statement? Because the slippers were never authenticated. That's the twist. While they had long been venerated as belonging to Saint Anselm, there was no carbon dating, no forensic record. The relic had value through belief, not science. Declaring it missing might have admitted too much ambiguity. In the words of one theologian, "You cannot lose what may never have existed, only the idea of it." 9. A death in Vienna. In 1995, a man was found dead in a modest pension in Vienna's 7th district. No ID, no known next of kin. The name he used was Brother Elia. He was elderly, thin, with traces of ink under his fingernails. In his satchel was a half-burned candle, a weathered copy of the Rule of Saint Benedict, and a small strip of velvet. The velvet, some said, resembled the lining of the original relic case from Santa Lucia di Sola. The Italian authorities were informed, but no match was ever confirmed. The man was cremated in silence. 10. A monastery that still waits. Santa Lucia di Sola remains active, though quieter than it once was. Tourism has slowed. Fewer monks take vows now. The chapel roof leaks in spring. But in the back of the sanctum where the slippers once lay, a single sandal now rests. Not behind glass. It sits openly on a linen cloth. No plaque, no label, just presence. Some say it was left in the night. Others claim it never left at all. The monks do not comment. Every March 17th, they still light a candle and place it beside the sandal. No words, no fanfare. Just silence, the loudest sound in a life devoted to faith. But what about Brother Matteo? If Aurelio was the man in Vienna, what became of the younger monk with a gift for carving wood and disappearing into plain sight? And more hauntingly, did they truly steal something, or did they return it to where it belonged? In 1999, 15 years after the disappearance of the slippers, an elderly woman named Greta Salomons in Ghent, Belgium, contacted a local priest. She claimed her tenant, a quiet man known as Marcello, had lived in her guest cottage for over a decade, and she suspected he had once been a monk. Not because he said so, she explained, but because he prayed before every meal, never used electricity, and once carved a crucifix from a single branch of pearwood that made me weep. She described him as delicate, like a man made of paper and light. He grew rosemary, he patched her roof, he never asked for rent. Then one day, he simply vanished. Inside the cottage, police found a small altar hand-carved. Tucked beneath the base was a folded note, written in Latin. The foot that follows does not ask to be seen. The path is its own reward. There was no name, but there was something else a drawing. A sketch of two simple wooden sandals, side by side. 2. The pattern in the dust. It was former investigative journalist Clara Bercy who noticed the pattern. She had written about obscure relics and religious crimes for over a decade, and became captivated by the idea that Matteo, or someone like him, was still moving. From Istanbul to Prague, from Vilnius to Ghent, and now perhaps beyond. She called it the Dust Trail because the signs were always faint. Never footprints, just disturbances in the stillness. In a convent in Cordoba, Spain, a novice reported that an elderly man had appeared in their garden, said nothing, and left a sandal carved entirely from olive wood by the well. In Uppsala, Sweden, a local church claimed a stranger restored their aging altar cross, then disappeared before being thanked. No one ever captured his image. No one ever confirmed a name. But in every case, the same detail lingered, the scent of freshly carved wood. 3. The philosophy of the disappeared. By the early 2000s, some scholars had begun reinterpreting the crime altogether. A book titled Liminal Faiths, The Monks Who Walked Out of Time, proposed that the theft was never about possession. Rather, it was an act of protest against the institutionalization of relics. They did not steal the object, they stole back the meaning, the author wrote. In a world obsessed with preserving holiness in glass, they chose to reanimate it through motion. This interpretation wasn't universally accepted. Vatican scholars dismissed it as romantic nonsense, but to others, it resonated. Pilgrimage, after all, was once about movement, about the body laboring towards sacred ground. Aurelio and Matteo, it was argued, had simply turned that belief back on itself. 4. An unexpected confession. In 2008, at a monastery in Taizé, France, a frail visitor arrived during Holy Week. He asked to take confession, but only under the condition of anonymity. He was taken to a private chamber. There, he spoke to Brother Jean-Claude, who later recorded his own recollections not of the penitent's name, but of the story he told. He spoke of a theft that was not a theft, of sandals that were kissed by pilgrims but never walked again, of how his companion, the older one, had long since crossed over into peace. He wept, he touched the floor and said, "It is enough that they touched this earth again." Brother Jean-Claude never learned his name, but the man left behind a wooden sandal wrapped in linen. 5. Carbon dating the artifact. At the urging of the Taizé community, the sandal was discreetly analyzed. A small fragment was carbon dated. It was determined to be European oak, likely from the 13th century. The style of carving matched those typical of religious artifacts from northern Italy. Traces of resin used in its preservation were consistent with monastic restoration techniques from the 1700s. In short, the sandal may very well have been one of the stolen slippers. But without the pair and without provenance, there was no way to confirm. The artifact was quietly stored. No official announcement was made. But the monastery placed a handwritten sign beneath it. Returned, walked, forgiven. 6. A meeting that never happened. In 2013, a letter arrived at the archives of Santa Lucia di Sola, handwritten, no return address, postmarked from Lviv, Ukraine. It was addressed simply, "To the brothers I left in silence." In it, the writer expressed sorrow, not for the act itself, but for the pain it had caused those who remained. He spoke of a life between borders, of sleeping under olive trees, of carrying something sacred not in hand, but in action. He ended the letter with a single phrase. The relic was never the slippers, it was the silence we broke. The monastery, now under new leadership, did not respond, but they filed the letter beside the earlier epistles. And on March 17th that year, the monks lit 3 candles instead of 1. 7. The monk in the forest. The most recent and possibly final sighting occurred in 2019. A group of hikers in the Vosges Mountains of eastern France reported encountering an elderly man sitting beneath a beech tree. He wore black robes, his feet bare. He smiled but did not speak. He offered one of the hikers a small wooden medallion, carved with a cross. When they looked back minutes later, he was gone. The medallion was later examined, on the back carved in Latin, Iter humo, iter sacrum. Humble path, sacred path. The hikers had no idea who he was, only that being near him had made them feel still. 8. So what really happened? There are 3 prevailing theories. Theory 1. The monastic pilgrimage. That Aurelio and Matteo staged a spiritual protest. They believed the relic belonged on the earth, not in a case. They took the slippers and walked the world with them, returning them bit by bit to the ground, to the churches, to the people. Theory 2. The devotional delusion. That the men suffered a shared psychological break. Obsessed with purity, they convinced themselves the theft was holy. Their journey was aimless, driven by guilt and theological rigidity. Theory 3. The romanticized escape. That it was simply escape, a longing to live free from the strict walls of cloistered life. The letters, sightings, and carved objects may have been real, but they could have been the work of imitators or enthusiasts, not Aurelio and Matteo. 9. The consequences. While no arrests were made and no charges filed, the case left a quiet scar. Monasteries across Italy updated their security procedures. Relics were catalogued and digitally archived. Some churches, in a nod to the event, began placing replicas rather than originals in public displays. More subtly, the story became a cautionary tale in seminary classes about obedience, faith, and the delicate boundary between devotion and delusion. In the cultural imagination, however, it lived on. The monks became figures of legend, not saints, not criminals, but something stranger, faithful fugitives. 10. A final image. Picture this. A man thin, weathered, quiet, walking barefoot through the early morning fog of a rural path in southern France. In his hand, a staff carved with simple designs. On his back, a satchel of linen. He pauses at a small chapel, kneels, touches the stone, and places something inside the door. Not a note, not a relic. A single sandal. Then he disappears into the mist. And so we're left with one last question. Did they vanish to escape, or to become what they truly believed in, silent walkers in the footsteps of saints? Maplefield, Ohio, was not the kind of place people noticed. It was tucked behind flat cornfields and near abandoned railways, population just under 3,800. There were 3 churches, 1 school, and 1 diner that had served the same meatloaf since 1974. And yet, in 2009, it made national news for all the wrong reasons. Because in April of that year, Maplefield's mayor, Dennis Holbrook, vanished without a trace. And along with him, over $2.3 million from the town's infrastructure budget. Not embezzled over decades, not skimmed off contracts, just gone in a single day. This wasn't New York or Chicago. There were no organized crime figures or offshore bank accounts. This was small-town government, where the biggest scandal in memory had been a stolen lawnmower. So how did one man, a trusted mayor, former Sunday school teacher, and local football hero, disappear with more money than the town made in a year? Let's go back to the beginning. 2. The mayor with a clean record. Dennis Holbrook was elected mayor of Maplefield in 1998 and re-elected 3 times. He ran unopposed twice. His reputation was sterling, polite, predictable, modest. He still drove his 1992 Ford Taurus and lived in the same brick ranch house his parents had built. His office was in the back of the Town Hall, a beige building that doubled as the firehouse and council chamber. His desk, cluttered with sticky notes, cheap pens, and a ceramic mug that read "One Mayor," a gift from a 4th-grade class. He earned a salary of $42,000 per year. There was never any sign of excess, no vacations, no unexplained absences, no flashy suits. He even coached the local Little League. But behind the scenes, something had changed. 3. The ARPA grant. In late 2008, Maplefield became eligible for a federal infrastructure grant, part of the American Recovery and Reinvestment Act, ARPA. The town had applied to upgrade its crumbling water system. Pipes from the 1930s were still in use, and some homes received brown-tinted water during the summer months. The approved grant was generous, $2.3 million. The money was wired to the town's municipal account on March 6, 2009. Mayor Holbrook, with authorization from the town council, was listed as one of the signatories for fund transfers. The other signatory, Councilwoman Irene Ledger, was hospitalized for gallbladder surgery that same week. On April 3, at exactly 10:14 a.m., a series of wire transfers were executed from the town's account. 4 in total. Each transfer routed to a different domestic bank, each under the limit that would trigger immediate IRS alerts, all routed through shell companies registered to addresses in neighboring counties. By 10:38 a.m., the entire $2.3 million had been moved. By noon, Mayor Holbrook was gone. 4. The empty office. Town hall employees reported seeing Dennis that morning. He wore his usual brown sweater and brought a Tupperware of leftovers. He made coffee, answered 2 emails, smiled at the receptionist. At 11:05 a.m., he was last seen walking out the front door. No one noticed anything odd until 2:00 p.m., when the Public Works Director came in to discuss a contractor bid and found the mayor's office door open, his desk chair still warm. His keys were missing. His car, the Ford Taurus, was still parked behind Town Hall. No note, no call, no sign of a struggle. Just absence. 5. The investigation begins. When Holbrook didn't return calls or show up to the evening council meeting, police were notified. By the next morning, local news was running the headline: "Mayor missing, no word, no warning." Within 48 hours, the missing money was discovered. The town accountant, reviewing monthly statements, found the balances didn't add up. She called the banks involved. Each confirmed the transfers, but they'd been authorized using Dennis's credentials and digital passcodes. The FBI was notified. A warrant was issued, but they were already behind. 6. The shell game. The companies receiving the funds, Elmside Consulting, Tower Aggregate, Midwest Futures, and Nash Holdings, had no employees, no revenue, and no obvious purpose. All had been incorporated within 60 days of the transfer, using mail forwarding services. FBI forensic accountants traced the money from the shell corporations into a complex web of subaccounts, cryptocurrency holdings, and prepaid debit cards. Then nothing. The money was effectively laundered, not with the sophistication of a cartel, but with the careful, manual planning of someone who'd spent years studying systems no one expected them to understand. Dennis Holbrook, the man who once struggled to use a projector, had executed a financial disappearance that rivaled career criminals. Or had he? 7. A man with no enemies. Investigators combed through Holbrook's life. No debts. No mistresses, no strange calls or late-night meetings, no connections to organized crime, no sudden purchases or secret properties. His emails were routine. His computer showed no incriminating activity. His browser history was shockingly boring: weather reports, school board minutes, amateur woodworking forums. He had no passport, no known aliases, no safety deposit boxes. His bank accounts had a combined balance of just under $1,200. His wife had passed away in 2005 from ovarian cancer. He had no children, just a sister in Tampa, Florida, who hadn't spoken to him in months. It didn't fit, none of it did. The working theory, that Dennis had been manipulated or blackmailed. But no one ever came forward. 8. A glitch in the pattern. Then something strange. In 2011, 2 years after his disappearance, a routine identity check flagged a curious hit. At a library in Emporia, Kansas, a man using a public terminal had accessed an email address associated with Holbrook's account from back in Maplefield. The man wore a faded baseball cap, had a beard, and walked with a slight limp. Security footage was grainy. He never checked out a book. He was gone within 12 minutes. When agents arrived 3 hours later, he was nowhere to be found. But it confirmed something chilling. Dennis Holbrook, or someone with access to his credentials, was still alive. 9. The letter. In 2013, a letter arrived at the Maplefield post office, addressed in blocky handwriting to whom it may concern, town of Maplefield. Inside was a single sheet of paper. It was never about the money. It was about what you didn't see, what you let happen. I am not your thief, I am your proof. There was no signature, no fingerprints, no traceable ink or watermark. But investigators found something subtle, a faint watermark only visible under infrared. A local printing press from Akron, Ohio, a press used almost exclusively for church bulletins. 10. And still no answers. Over the next decade, leads dwindled. The FBI quietly closed its active investigation in 2017, citing resource exhaustion and lack of credible sightings. Maplefield, too, moved on slowly. A special election was held, new leadership came in, a second, smaller infrastructure grant was awarded. The water lines were finally upgraded, though the work took years longer. Dennis Holbrook's house remained empty, but the town refused to sell it. It became a quiet landmark, nicknamed the Mayor's Graveyard. And every April 3rd, on the anniversary of his disappearance, someone leaves a folded newspaper on the porch. Always the Cincinnati Enquirer. Always turned to the financial section. So who was Dennis Holbrook really? A quiet mastermind, a manipulated scapegoat, or a man who cracked under invisible pressure and used the only tool no one saw him wielding: invisibility? And if it wasn't about the money, what was it about? Her name was Lou Brewster, and she wasn't a detective, just Maplefield's part-time municipal accountant. She worked 3 days a week, wore floral scarves year-round, and kept her files in color-coded folders, not digital spreadsheets. But she was the first person who refused to believe that Mayor Holbrook had acted alone. I knew him for over a decade, she told investigators. He couldn't figure out the fax machine. You're telling me he set up shell corporations, structured fund transfers, and laundered millions through crypto wallets, all without any help? I don't buy it. After the FBI closed their case in 2017, Lou didn't. She requested documents, filed FOIAs, and even started a blog called Where's the Mayor Now? It wasn't wildly popular, a few hundred readers at best, but it kept the case alive in quiet corners of the internet. And one day in 2020, she received a strange email from a man who signed only as Cliff. The subject line: "He didn't act alone, you're looking at the wrong person." To the IT guy. Back in 2008, Maplefield's town hall had finally upgraded to a proper computer network, nothing fancy, just enough to connect offices and back up municipal records. The contract had been handled by a small tech support outfit based out of Columbus called CoreLink Solutions. They were hired to configure email servers and install security protocols. The job took 2 weeks. The lead technician on the job, a man named Clifford Mayers. On paper, he was forgettable. Mid-30s, no criminal record, clean credit history. But Mayers had once worked in financial systems support for a now-defunct investment firm. He left the company just months before it collapsed in an SEC scandal. In short, he knew how systems could be manipulated, quietly. Cliff Mayers wasn't on anyone's radar during the initial investigation, but in Llewellyn's blog comments, he began leaving breadcrumbs. 3. A strange series of purchases. Llewellyn handed the tips over to a private investigator she hired with her own retirement savings. Together, they traced a series of unusual purchases made in 2009 and 2010. Expensive amateur radio equipment, rare coins, and small parcels of land in remote areas of Idaho, Utah, and South Carolina. Each property was purchased under a trust, using prepaid debit cards, the same kind used to launder the stolen funds. The common denominator. The purchases were all arranged online, using servers routed through a specific proxy service, based in New Mexico, a service known to have been used previously by CoreLink Solutions during diagnostic testing. One login credential found in a dark web leak matched an old, unused CoreLink admin profile. The password, Belvedere 76, the brand of aftershave Holbrook used, and a favorite talking point of his in small-town barbershop banter. A password only someone very close, or with direct access to Holbrook's workspace, could have known. 4. The pressure cooker theory. So how did Dennis Holbrook, a man without a criminal record, or even a parking ticket, end up at the center of a vanishing act? A psychological profile assembled by a forensic psychiatrist, commissioned by the private investigator, suggested what's called a pressure cooker personality. Individuals who follow rules to the letter for decades can, under specific conditions, experience a catastrophic moral collapse. Not due to greed, but due to humiliation, repressed anger, or existential disillusionment. Holbrook may have been exploited. Cliff Mayers, the IT contractor, had access. If he manipulated Holbrook subtly, incrementally, with a promise of purpose or some righteous justification, Holbrook might have rationalized the crime as noble or even necessary. It's called ethical reframing, where the criminal act is reinterpreted as a moral duty. And if Holbrook truly believed Maplefield was being ignored by the government, perhaps he thought he was taking back what was rightfully theirs. 5. The funeral in Tampa. In late 2020, Holbrook's sister, Margaret, passed away from a stroke in Florida. Her small funeral was attended by only a few people, mostly neighbors and church friends. But one attendee stood out. A man in a gray wool coat with wire-frame glasses and thinning hair stood silently at the back, never approaching the family. He left before the service ended, walking out as the choir began singing "Abide with Me." The funeral director later described him as unremarkable, but strangely still. A car waiting outside took him away, a black sedan with no plates. When the guest book was reviewed, someone had signed with a simple DH and a quote beneath it. Still waters run deep, still men deeper. 6. Disappearance as a craft. By now, years had passed, and the narrative around the missing mayor had transformed. To the town, he had become a mixture of shame and legend. The local kids told ghost stories about the mayor's house, and some even left Monopoly money in the mailbox each April 3rd. But to academics and crime analysts, Holbrook's case was something rarer, A disappearance as an engineered craft not done in desperation, but with extreme patience and self-erasure. According to a 2021 panel at the Midwestern Criminology Conference, Holbrook's act had none of the usual signatures of criminal escape. No offshore accounts, no vanity purchases, no indulgent behavior. In fact, it was almost monastic, like he had planned to vanish, not to flee. 7. What the FBI missed. A FOIA request unearthed a memo buried in a stack of case notes from the original investigation. It was from an agent stationed in Akron, dated May 2009. It read, "Subject may have used the St. Marlow Retreat Center as an initial safe location. Property matches initial satellite pings. No resources available to confirm." The St. Marlow Retreat Center was a defunct Catholic facility closed in 2007, located about 80 miles from Maplefield. It had been unoccupied for years and scheduled for demolition. By the time anyone followed up on the lead, the building had been razed. But former groundskeepers claimed that in 2009, a man had paid them in cash to stay quiet, while he used one of the storage buildings for archiving personal materials. The man, polite, quiet, middle-aged, carried a briefcase and 2 boxes of what looked like files. No one ever asked questions. The center was full of odd guests over the years. But it raises the possibility, was Holbrook there? And if so, what was he storing? 8. The voice message. In 2022, Lou Ann Brewster received a call to her office landline, not cell, from an unknown number. No one spoke on the other end, just static. But later that night, when she checked her voicemail, there was a message, a man's voice, calm, familiar, soft. "You were right, it wasn't mine to keep. But it had to go somewhere, they couldn't find it. Thank you for keeping the light on. That town needs it more than I ever did." The message was traced to a burner phone activated and deactivated within 24 hours, purchased in a rest stop outside Cheyenne, Wyoming. Voice analysis suggested a 90% probability match to archived public recordings of Dennis Holbrook. It was the closest thing to confirmation anyone had heard in 13 years. 9. The final account. Later that year, an anonymous $230,000 donation was made to the Maplefield Public School District. The money arrived in the form of cashier's checks from regional banks, all dated over a span of a decade, as if someone had been holding them for just this purpose. No sender was named. The checks were clean, legal. One note arrived with them. It read, "A beginning, not repayment." It was signed again, only with DH. So where does that leave us? With a man who vanished not out of greed, but out of disillusionment. With a crime that stripped a town of its mayor, but possibly gave it a myth in return. And with a question, what do we do with someone who disappears, not to escape justice, but to erase their former self completely? In the Maplefield Town Council chamber, a modest room with plastic chairs and an aging linoleum floor, there's still a nameplate sitting behind the central desk. Dennis Holbrook, Mayor. The new mayor, Elaine Cruz, keeps it there intentionally, not out of reverence or nostalgia, but as a reminder. "It's not about punishing a ghost," she told a local reporter. "It's about remembering what silence costs." Because silence, more than any stolen money or unanswered questions, became the legacy Dennis Holbrook left behind. 2. A second donation. In early 2024, just a year after the first anonymous contribution to the school district, another arrived, this time in the amount of $530,000, broken into 6 cashier's checks. No note. Just a return address, not to a house or business, but to a wildlife sanctuary in northern Montana. The sanctuary, when contacted, confirmed that a quiet older gentleman had volunteered there for 2 years, helping maintain fencing and animal enclosures. He went by Don, paid in cash. No social media, no phone. He left abruptly in the fall of 2023, telling the staff he was moving south. His cabin, clean, empty, but a worn copy of the Ohio State Constitution was found under the cot, with a single underlined passage. All political power is inherent in the people. 3. The auditor's report. The Ohio State Auditor reopened its review of Maplefield's missing funds in light of the donations, and issued a new report nearly 15 years after the theft. It included the following line: though much of the original $2.3 million remains unaccounted for, we observe that approximately 41% has been returned in some form to public institutions. Whether through guilt, conscience, or strategy, the act is notable. But notably absent was any recommendation to pursue further charges. Because there was still no physical evidence, no confirmation that Holbrook was even alive. Legally, he remained a missing person. 4. What people remember. Among the townsfolk, memories of Dennis Holbrook are strangely warm. They recall his fatherly manner, his awkward public speaking, his insistence on shaking hands with every business owner personally before passing a new ordinance. They also remember his deep frustration in the months before his disappearance, his concerns about state underfunding, his arguments with the county water board, his disappointment over the school levy that failed twice. Some say he broke. Others say he acted with purpose. A few, usually the older generation, say he simply woke up one day and realized he didn't trust the systems he had spent his life maintaining. 5. An interview never aired. In a box of forgotten VHS tapes found in a regional news station's storage room in Dayton, a 2009 interview was discovered. It had never aired. The interview was with Holbrook, conducted just weeks before his disappearance. It was mostly routine questions about budgets and water main repairs. But near the end, the reporter asked, "Do you ever feel the weight of being the only one accountable?" Dennis smiled, shrugged. "All the time, that's the job. The chair looks like it's made of wood, but it's concrete underneath, heavy. So why do you stay?" He looked away for a second, then replied, "Because if I ever left, I don't think anyone would know how deep the cracks really go." 6. What was hidden. Investigative threads over the years unearthed small but telling details. A destroyed town contract that funneled inflated consulting fees to a county commissioner. A private land deal involving a toxic waste site that nearly went public. And a $400,000 discrepancy in road repair allocations that had been buried under years of bureaucratic reshuffling. All of it occurring in the years leading up to Holbrook's disappearance. Did he know? Was the money he moved truly for himself, or had he taken it to prevent it from being stolen by others? This is the most compelling theory among modern investigators. That Holbrook didn't just steal from Maplefield, he intercepted a theft already underway. 7. The waiting game. To this day, Maplefield receives strange packages. In 2021, a small envelope containing a thumb drive with digital copies of archived grant documents scanned and indexed more neatly than anything they'd had. In 2023, a bound report with detailed audits of public spending from the early 2000s, authored anonymously. And just last spring, a single USB stick labeled, "It's not too late to change the system. You just have to know where the leaks are." Who sends them? No return addresses, no fingerprints, but every file is legitimate. Every document checks out. Whoever the sender is, they have access. 8. So where is Dennis Holbrook? Theories abound. He's dead, that he died years ago in solitude, and others have carried on his work posthumously. He's underground, living under an assumed identity, perhaps helping others pull off quiet audits or disappearing acts. He's watching, that he returns to Maplefield occasionally, slipping in for a town meeting, leaving anonymous notes, or tending the lawn of his abandoned house at night. One thing for certain, whoever orchestrated the crime was not impulsive. They were deliberate, focused, and very, very patient. 9. Legacy in the absence. There is now a course at Ohio State University titled Governance, Ethics, and Disappearance, the Case of Mayor Holbrook. It explores themes of moral ambiguity, civic failure, and the psychology of whistleblowing. What's more, students don't always see Holbrook as a villain. Some see him as a tragic figure, someone who wanted to fix the leak by pulling the plug. Others say he was tired of patching holes in a sinking ship. Either way, he has become a lesson in what happens when accountability becomes invisible. 10. The Final Ledger. On April 3, 2025, exactly 16 years to the day since the theft, a final letter arrived at Maplefield Town Hall. It was addressed to the new mayor and town council. Inside was a note and a single sheet of paper, a ledger. The ledger listed every dollar taken, every dollar returned or donated, and a handwritten note at the bottom. If I had told you the truth then, you would have ignored it. So I stole it instead. Not the money, the attention. It was signed, D.H. Still accountable. And so we end with this. What do we call a man who vanishes with public money, leaves breadcrumbs of confession, and slowly returns it piece by piece, not in penance, but in protest? A criminal, a martyr, or something more troubling, a citizen who no longer believed in asking permission. In the spring of 2014, the rural town of Ottawa, Kansas, was preparing for yet another small-town ritual, the auction of a deceased woman's estate. Her name was Joanne Ellen Traver, a retired school nurse who had lived on a farm just outside of town limits for over 40 years. She passed in her sleep at 83, no children, no spouse, and no known surviving relatives. Her farmhouse sat on 5 acres of cracked earth and grain sheds, most of them long since empty. Locals who came to the auction expected the usual: faded furniture, dusty china sets, stacks of Reader's Digest, and mismatched jars of buttons. No one expected a body, especially not a frozen one, curled in a fetal position in the back corner of a deep chest freezer in the barn. And definitely not a body that had been there for at least 30 years. 2. The freezer. The freezer had been listed on the auction flyer simply as one vintage deep freeze barn, contents unknown. One buyer, 69-year-old Harold Zimmer, had bid $45 on it, hoping to repurpose the hardware for scrap. It was old, rusted in corners, smelling faintly of ammonia. It hadn't been plugged in for years, but it was still sealed shut with duct tape. Zimmer used a pocket knife to slice through the layers. When he pried it open, the first thing he noticed was the blankets, folded neatly as if protecting something. Then came the odor, faint but unmistakable. He pulled the top layer back and saw the curve of a shoulder. And then bone. 3. A body in stasis. Ottawa police arrived by mid-morning. The area was cordoned off, and the barn was treated as a crime scene. Forensics teams were careful, very careful. The body was partially mummified, partially preserved. Cold storage had slowed decomposition, but not completely. The skeletal structure was intact, but soft tissue had long since degraded. The person was male. Estimated height, 58. Cause of death, unclear. No visible trauma, no binding, no signs of restraint. But most peculiar, the body had been placed carefully, wrapped in 3 blankets, with a single can of Dr. Pepper placed near the chest. Why the can? Why the blankets? Who was he? And how did a retired nurse end up with a corpse in her freezer? 4. Who was Joanne Traver? Born in 1931, Joanne Traver was an ordinary woman. She spent most of her life as a school nurse in Franklin County, known for her quiet manner, strict rules, and a fondness for gardening. She never married. Her only sibling, a younger brother named Martin, had died in Vietnam in 1969. Her neighbors described her as polite but private. She attended church irregularly and never hosted guests. After retiring in 1993, she became increasingly reclusive. Her grocery trips were rare. Her phone rarely rang. She didn't use the internet. There were no police reports, no criminal history, nothing in her records to suggest a woman capable of harboring a secret for decades, let alone hiding a corpse. But someone at some point had died on her property, and she had done nothing about it. 5. The forensic puzzle. The Kansas Bureau of Investigation, KBI, took over the body's examination. Dental records yielded no match. DNA was extracted, but ran into complications. The sample was degraded from prolonged freezing and moisture exposure. Still, mitochondrial markers indicated the individual was Caucasian, male, likely aged mid-30s to early 40s, with a slight curvature of the spine. Carbon isotope analysis suggested the man had grown up somewhere in the American Midwest. In his pockets, nothing. No wallet, no ID, no jewelry, just a flannel shirt and work trousers. The only clue was the Dr. Pepper can vintage design, 1982 label, unopened, slightly dented. A deliberate placement, a sentimental object, or just trash tossed in during a panic. 6. Old neighbors, old names. Investigators canvassed elderly residents of the surrounding area, people who had known Joanne during her active years. Several recalled a handyman, someone named Raymond or Rick, who'd been seen on her property during the early 1980s. He helped her build a chicken coop, said one neighbor. Tall guy, kinda hunched, always wore flannel. Another remembered a man with a camper van parked near her barn for a while. Records were spotty, but a search through county tax filings revealed a man named Richard Dale Griggs, who had listed Joanne's property as a mailing address in 1983 on a voter registration form, then disappeared. Further digging turned up a matching name on a missing persons report from Missouri, filed by a sister in 1984. It had gone cold within a year. Photos compared. The spine curvature matched, so did height, build, and last known location. KBI made a presumptive match. The body was very likely Richard Dale Griggs, last seen in Ottawa, Kansas, in the fall of 1983. 7. Who was Richard Griggs? Born in 1947 in Springfield, Missouri, Richard Griggs was a Vietnam veteran and part-time carpenter. His life after the war had been unstable, a mix of seasonal work, short-term rentals, and reported battles with depression. He drifted north into Kansas around 1981, working odd jobs in small towns. His sister Marion described him as sweet but lost. He was last heard from in a letter postmarked October 1983, written on motel stationery, addressed to his mother, with a note that he was helping a nice woman fix up her property. That woman was almost certainly Joanne Traver. 8. The woman who never told. Why didn't Joanne report the death? Did she kill him? Or did he die accidentally and she panicked? Or more unsettling, did she feel protective of his body? One theory suggests mental deterioration, that Joanne may have had undiagnosed dementia and chose denial over reality. Another theory paints her as a recluse who may have felt responsible and simply decided to shut the barn and forget. Yet there were no journal entries, no confessions, no will, no instructions. She lived in that house for 3 more decades, knowing a body was stored in her barn. She tended her garden, paid her taxes, renewed her driver's license, and never told a soul. 9. The Dr. Pepper clue. The soda can intrigued investigators. In 1983, that specific design was part of a limited promotional run, part of a Retro Americana series, released only in Kansas, Missouri, and parts of Oklahoma. Was it a favorite drink, a gift, or a private signal? Griggs' sister remembered. He loved Dr. Pepper, always drank it warm, said it tasted like licorice and old baseball games. Had Joanne placed it there out of memory? A kind of memorial? Or had he done it himself knowing he was dying? Still, the can posed more questions than it answered. 10. The coldest room in town. The barn has since been sealed. The freezer, now a forensic exhibit, sits in a KBI warehouse outside Topeka. And Richard Griggs, he received a proper burial in 2015, courtesy of a veterans organization. Only 3 people attended: his sister, her husband, and Harold Zimmer, the man who discovered the freezer. No charges were ever filed. There was no one left to charge. But Ottawa, Kansas, still talks about the nurse in the freezer. A quiet crime, a frozen man, a soda can. And a woman who kept a secret frozen in silence for 30 years. But what really happened that night in 1983? Did Joanne find Richard already dead and choose to bury his memory in the cold? Or was she hiding more than just a body? After the body of Richard Griggs was discovered in 2014, a second round of investigation swept through Joanne Travers' property. Forensic teams took their time not because they expected danger, but because they suspected something more elusive: long-decayed context. Joanne's house was preserved almost perfectly, as if she had pressed pause on her life sometime in the 1990s and simply never hit play again. But there was something off. All of the clocks in the house had been unplugged or had dead batteries. Every single one: kitchen, bedroom, even the small travel alarm on her nightstand. None had been reset. It raised an unsettling thought. Had she tried to freeze time in her own way? 2. The basement box. In the basement, behind a filing cabinet and old water heater, a cardboard box was found, labeled in red marker: "Winter things do not open." Inside were 3 folded flannel shirts, men's size medium, a pair of dusty work gloves, a Polaroid photo of a man sitting on a barn roof, waving, and a composition notebook titled "Recipes and Dreams." The notebook was mostly filled with mundane entries: soup recipes, gardening notes, phone numbers. But tucked in the back were a few cryptic lines. "He fixed the door but couldn't fix himself. When the leaves fall, he gets quiet again. Sometimes I hear him in the barn, even when I know I'm alone. Dr. Pepper for the soul." The handwriting was shaky, deteriorating. Some lines were dated. The last was from 2009. 3. A photo story. The Polaroid was key. It showed a younger man, probably Richard, perched on the barn's roof with a hammer in one hand and a can in the other. A second figure was visible in the lower frame, blurred and out of focus. A woman, likely Joanne, holding the ladder. The photo had a date smudged in blue pen, 9/22/83. That placed the image just weeks before Richard disappeared. Had something happened during that project? Had an accident occurred, leading to his death? Investigators returned to the barn. 4. The roof theory. An inspection of the barn roof revealed something subtle. One of the beams beneath the south side was warped, slightly cracked, and recently reinforced with newer brackets. The repair was done in the early 80s, based on the type of hardware used. An idea formed: what if Richard had fallen? An undiagnosed head injury, maybe even a slow internal bleed, could have caused confusion, fatigue, and death within hours. No witnesses, no emergency call, just panic. And Joanne, alone on her farm, may have chosen silence over shame. 5. The town remembers. By now, stories were emerging. An old hardware store employee remembered Joanne coming in with a cracked ladder in late 1983. She was distraught, he said. Kept saying, "I should have fixed it myself." A former student recalled how Joanne once told a health class, "Head injuries can be tricky. You might feel fine and then just not wake up." Even the mail carrier remembered a change. She stopped putting mail in the box, he said, started coming into town instead, kept to herself. Grief can look like many things, but guilt it echoes. 6. The library records. One surprising find came from the Ottawa Public Library. Joanne had borrowed a number of books between 1984 and 1985. Among them, Silent Deaths, Understanding Closed Head Injuries, Preservation Without Chemicals, Techniques for Home and Field, The Ethics of Solitude, Missing Persons, When to Report, What to Expect. Most were returned. Some were not. A record showed she had renewed the preservation book 7 times. She had clearly been preparing for something. Not a murder, perhaps, but a containment. 7. Was there a confession? In 2015, a local newspaper reporter named Janice Vale began writing a series of articles titled The Frozen Years. She focused on the emotional core of the mystery, what it meant for a woman to keep a body in her barn for 30 years without telling a soul. One article included an interview with Joanne's former pastor. He claimed off the record that Joanne had once come to him late at night in 1986, asking if a sin of silence could still be forgiven. She never said what, he told Janice, but she cried like she had just buried someone. The article caused a stir, but without specifics, it was just another echo. 8. What the medical examiner concluded. In late 2015, after extensive reanalysis, the KBI issued a supplemental report on Richard Griggs' remains. While cause of death was still inconclusive, a hairline fracture was found on the base of the skull, the kind consistent with a fall. The injury could have been survivable or lethal, depending on how quickly help was sought. But it supported the accident theory. Still, no criminal charges could be filed. Joanne Traver, dead since 2014, had no legal obligation to preserve or report evidence once the statute of limitations for concealment had expired. And in Kansas, the concealment of a corpse becomes unchargeable after 5 years, unless linked to another crime. 9. The refrigerator as coffin. There is something deeply symbolic about the freezer. It was not a trash bin, not a place to discard or forget. It was lined with blankets. It had near the body an unopened can of Dr. Pepper Griggs, a parent favorite. In some ways, the freezer wasn't a hiding place. It was a tomb, a kind of frozen, makeshift sarcophagus where time stood still, and so did memory. And perhaps in Joanne's mind, she hadn't failed to bury him. She had preserved him, kept him safe, in the only way she knew how. 10. A quiet end. Richard Griggs was buried with military honors in 2015. His sister Marion spoke at the funeral. She said, "I wish I had found you sooner. I wish the world had been kinder, but I'm glad you weren't alone. I hope she loved you in whatever way she could." As for Joanne Traver, she remains an enigma. Her gravestone reads only, "She gave care." Some call her a recluse, some whisper she was mad. But others, including Janice Vale, wonder if she was simply overwhelmed and made a choice no one else could understand. But one question still lingers. If Joanne had told someone, the police, a friend, a priest, would anyone have believed her? Or was the silence the only thing she trusted, more than justice? Some crimes leave trails of blood, burned documents, or sirens echoing into the night. Others leave nothing. No noise, no motive, Just decades of waiting until the truth is uncovered, not by confession or surveillance, but by accident. Richard Griggs didn't go missing from a crowded city or during a high-speed chase. He simply never mailed the next letter. No police came looking. No dogs searched the field. No missing posters were hung in Ottawa, Kansas. His absence was so ordinary, it was overlooked. And Joanne Traver, she lived with that absence for 30 years like someone living in a house with a boarded-up room, pretending it wasn't there. But it was always. 2. The final journal. In 2016, after a distant relative of Joanne's tried to make sense of her belongings, a final journal was found stashed in a manila envelope marked "Private Barn Only." The journal was sporadic, filled mostly with garden notes and scripture. But between the entries, something else emerged. Memories, almost like letters written to someone who would never read them. One read: "I made stew tonight. You always said mine was too salty. I didn't argue. I knew you liked it better that way. It snowed today. I told the barn not to feel cold. I brought in another blanket. Sometimes I think you're still dreaming in there, like a bear." Another: "I didn't mean for it to happen. I wasn't fast enough. You said you were dizzy and I didn't listen." And one more scrawled at the very end: "I kept you safe, didn't I? You're the only warmth I never buried." 3. The psychology of prolonged concealment. Criminologists call cases like this emotional containment crimes. They're not driven by greed or hatred, but by isolation and the fear of public shame. Dr. Elise Handler, a forensic psychologist consulted by the KBI, later wrote, "In such cases, the person concealing the death does not see themselves as criminal. They often see themselves as guardian of the memory, the reputation, or the reality itself." Joanne may have convinced herself that no one would believe it was an accident. Or maybe she simply couldn't bear to give Richard Griggs back to the world, not when the world had ignored him for so long. 4. Richard's life reclaimed. After his remains were confirmed and buried, Marion Griggs did something unusual. She filed a petition with the county court to posthumously recover her brother's record school files, military documents, even traffic citations. She wanted them all gathered into a binder and donated to the Franklin County Historical Society. "I don't want him to vanish again," she said. Today, that binder sits in a glass case in a quiet corner of the museum under the title, "Richard Dale Griggs, A Life Interrupted." Next to it, a single, unopened can of Dr. Pepper. 5. The Cold Room Revisited. 2 years after the discovery, journalist Janice Vale, who had covered the case in depth, was granted access to the sealed barn. She was escorted by a detective and a historian from the KBI. The barn was quiet, the freezer long since removed, but the air still smelled faintly of dust, rust, and something deeper, a stillness that seemed to resist time itself. In one corner, etched faintly into the wooden wall, were 2 initials, R+J, and beneath it, September 1983. Not a love note. Not quite, but something like it. 6. The retired deputy's words. Retired Franklin County Deputy Gerald Marcus had been a young patrol officer in the 80s. He told Vale in an interview, "We didn't think twice back then. A drifter didn't write home, must have moved on. A quiet woman kept to herself. That's just Kansas." He paused. "But I think she was waiting, maybe not for police, but for someone to ask the right question." What was the right question? Not "Did you do it?" but maybe, "Were you ever forgiven?" 7. Cold cases, cold people. This story wasn't the most brutal in Kansas history. No blood spatter, no pursuit. And yet, it haunted people more than many open and shut homicides. Because it blurred the lines. It asked uncomfortable things. What is justice when the crime is wrapped in tenderness? What is guilt when paired with grief? And what does it mean to keep someone's death, not as a secret, but as a responsibility? In a state where winters bury the land in silence, Joanne Traver had created a permanent winter in her barn. One only thawed when she passed away. 8. A town that listened too late. After the case gained national attention, Ottawa held a town meeting not about crime or police budgets, but about loneliness. It was attended by more than 200 residents, more than the city council had ever seen. They spoke about elderly neighbors, about veterans living alone, about former students now lost in the shuffle of addiction and housing insecurity. The mayor at the time, Carol Bremer, closed the meeting with this: "It's not just about who hid what. It's about who we didn't ask, who we never checked in on, and who we let disappear slowly, quietly, until all we had left was a freezer and a can of soda." 9. The barn comes down. In 2020, the barn, weather-worn and structurally unsafe, was finally demolished. Before it came down, Marion Griggs visited the site. She picked up a small stone from the threshold and placed it in her pocket. She didn't cry, she didn't speak. But she left something behind. A folded note, sealed in a Ziploc bag, placed on the foundation slab. No one opened it. She said it wasn't for us. 10. So what was the crime? Legally, it was probably concealment of a body. Ethically, it was something harder to define. Joanne Traver did not murder Richard Griggs. But she also didn't tell the truth. She let a family grieve for 30 years without answers. She watched the seasons change, knowing one life never got to. And yet, in some strange way, she preserved him. In silence, in cold, in memory. And so we're left with one final thought. Was this a crime or a kind of penance? A cover-up or a frozen act of care that no one else could see for what it was? For nearly 6 years, residents of Littleton, Vermont, proudly pointed visitors to a quaint brick building off a back road near the Connecticut River. It was marked by a simple wooden sign: the Rosebridge Museum of European Art. Tourists snapped photos in front of the Iron Gate. Locals swore by the lectures held in the upstairs gallery. High school art students toured the collection twice a year. But hear the truth. There was no museum license, no registered foundation, no insurance policy, and most jarringly, most of the art was fake. The Rosebridge Museum never existed on paper, but it stood there, open every Saturday from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. for nearly 6 years. The man behind it, a retired librarian named Douglas N. Hartwell. 2. The man in the cardigan. Douglas Hartwell was 72 when the museum finally closed in 2020. But for the townspeople of Littleton, he had been a fixture for decades. Former head of archives at the regional library, pipe smoker, wearer of tweed cardigans with mismatched buttons. He lived alone, never married, always polite, and obsessed lovingly, obsessively with European art history, particularly Dutch Golden Age painters. He spoke with authority, referred to our collection in public talks, and gave weekly tour of lesser-known but important 17th-century works to wide-eyed locals. It all seemed charmingly homespun. The museum only asked for donations, no tickets, no fees. He made tea for visitors, answered questions. So when federal investigators arrived in January 2020, few believed it. Until they saw the catalog. 3. The discovery. It was a routine insurance audit that tipped things off. A visiting appraiser, working on a separate estate in New Hampshire, had seen a Rosebridge Museum brochure featuring a long-lost Franz Hals portrait. Curious, he visited on a Saturday. What he saw shocked him. Not because the painting was a fake, but because it was a good fake. Very good. He reported the museum to the FBI's art crime team. A month later, the building was searched under sealed warrant. Inside were 84 framed paintings, 17 sculptures, dozens of display placards and faux acquisition records, a guest book with over 4,300 names, and a locked file cabinet filled with forged letters of provenance. No one was arrested that day, but the Rosebridge Museum quietly shut its doors, and Douglas Hartwell vanished. For the fakes, art experts later determined that of the 84 paintings, 72 were forgeries, 8 were unidentifiable copies, 4 were originals by unknown or student artists, passed off as rediscovered works. What shocked investigators wasn't just the deception, it was the skill. These weren't eBay knockoffs. Many were museum-grade forgeries, convincingly aged with cracking mediums, dust layering, and even forged restoration records. And yet, they were all displayed without profit. Hartwell never sold a single piece. The museum had accepted small donations estimated total under $6,000, which went toward utilities, tea supplies, and maintenance. So why go to all this trouble? 5. The archives. The building's second floor, thought to be off-limits, was found to contain dozens of books on forgery techniques, labeled jars of paint chemicals, varnishes, and antique dust, high-end inkjet printers and antique paper, forged letters from supposed donors in Italy, France, and the UK. But most bizarre were the journals. Hartwell had kept meticulous logs of every piece in the collection. One excerpt read, "Replica 16, after Vermeer, 2 brushstroke adjustments made, applied craquelure with gelatin solution, hung in gallery C2, guests admired it, noted depth, no suspicion." Another, "The illusion must never aim to deceive for profit, only to provide the weight of beauty where bureaucracy has failed." 6. The illusion of belief. One art investigator, Judith Keene, later wrote, "Hartwell's crime was not of greed, but of credibility. He built a false institution that felt more real than some actual ones. The locals weren't tricked, they were inspired." In fact, many refused to believe the paintings were fake. "He told us," one resident said, "that these weren't masterpieces, they were memories made visible. That felt true." The town had thrown Rosebridge Day celebrations. School fundraisers were held in its courtyard. Engagement photos were taken under its sign. The crime wasn't theft. It was fiction written in oils and hung on walls. 7. Who was Douglas Hartwell? Born in 1947 in Poughkeepsie, New York, Hartwell had moved to Littleton in the 1980s after a quiet library career. He held degrees in both art history and restoration science. In the 1970s, he'd worked briefly for the Metropolitan Museum of Art, cataloging acquisitions. A former colleague remembered him as brilliant but invisible. He vanished from the professional scene in 1983. Some believe he suffered a professional humiliation, a disputed authentication, or perhaps being passed over for a curator role. He never published, never married, left no digital footprint. In Littleton, he simply became Doug from the library. 8. The Vanishing Act. After the museum closed, Hartwell was seen one final time checking out books from the very library he once ran. He nodded to the librarian, asked for something on ancient pigments, and left on foot. His car was later found abandoned near a hiking trail along the river. No note, no signs of foul play. Just a man-sized absence in a town now doubting its own memories. 9. The Guest Book. Investigators reviewed all 4,300 guest entries. Among them were local students, international tourists, 2 minor art critics who had praised the humble authenticity of the space. But more telling were the comments. "This museum feels like being inside a secret." The Vermeer made me cry. I don't care if it's real. Thank you for keeping beauty alive. No one reported being misled. In fact, many wrote letters defending Hartwell, calling the experience more moving than any official gallery. 10. So what was the crime? Legally, Hartwell violated federal statutes involving fraudulent provenance documents and misrepresentation of artwork, even without selling them. But ethically, that depends on what you think a museum is. Is it a collection of verified artifacts? Or a shared act of belief in meaning, beauty, and history? Douglas Hartwell curated a fantasy, a careful illusion, one that hurt no one and elevated a town. But it was still a lie built brick by brick, painting by painting. So here's the question. If something is fake, but makes you feel something real, was it truly a crime? 6 months after the Rosebridge Museum was shut down, the Littleton Historical Society received a small envelope with no return address. Inside was a typewritten letter on cream-colored stationery. It read, "The mistake wasn't in the forgery. The mistake was in assuming anyone would care once they found out. I didn't steal, I substituted. The absence of the real is not the absence of truth." Signed, D&H. No fingerprints, no paper trace. But the phrasing matched dozens of journal entries found in Hartwell's handwriting. He was alive, somewhere, still speaking through prose instead of paint. 2. The studio below. Beneath the museum's main floor, there had once been a storage area originally part of the building's boiler room. Local legend claimed it was filled with dusty old books or lost exhibits. When investigators finally accessed the basement, they discovered a functioning studio with easels, paint-stained rags, and chemical trays. Reference photographs tacked to cork boards, mostly Rembrandt, Hals, and obscure Flemish works. Dozens of unfinished paintings, many clearly meant to resemble known works lost in time. One half-finished piece was labeled, "Portrait of a woman with black ribbon, a trib. To A. de Vos, c. 1650. There is no such known painter." But the painting felt believable. And perhaps that was the point. 3. The forgery as devotion. Most art forgers seek profit or at the very least recognition, not Hartwell. He lived on a pension. His bills were modest. No sales were traced. Not one painting ever left the property, not even on loan. It became clear he wasn't imitating for gain. He was curating an imagined museum, one that filled historical gaps, one that gave forgotten beauty a stage. Dr. Emery Keane, an art historian brought in during the investigation, described it this way. Hartwell didn't forge to deceive. He forged to fulfill, to construct a narrative in which art didn't disappear into war, fire, or indifference. 4. A stranger's claim. In late 2020, a woman named Margaret Elvington came forward, claiming she had corresponded with Hartwell in the early 2000s. They had met in a genealogy forum, she said, and exchanged letters for 5 years, mostly about European art and lost works destroyed during World War II. He believed that the world had holes in it, Margaret told reporters, and that art could fill those holes even if it wasn't real. She said he mailed her a painting once, a portrait of a woman with melancholy eyes. She no longer had it. It was damaged in a flood. But she remembered the back of the canvas. Stamped, "In absence there is form." 5. The town responds. When news of the museum's closure spread, Littleton grieved not with anger, but with confusion. People asked, was it really fake if we believed it? Why didn't he just say it was his work? What happens to the memories made there? Some called for his arrest. Others petitioned to reopen the building as a community gallery. One town council member proposed a motion to preserve the space not as a museum, but as an artistic anomaly worth remembering. The motion passed 5-2. Today, the building is officially designated the Hartwell House for Imagined Art. Inside, all the forgeries remain, framed, labeled. But now the placards are honest. A work in the style of Vermeer painted by Douglas Hartwell, c. 2004. Untitled Landscape, inspired by Rysdale Douglas Hartwell. The Rosebridge Madonna original work, faux provenance. 6. The ethics debate. The art world remains divided. Some say Hartwell undermined trust in smaller museums, and that even harmless forgery dilutes historical integrity. Others argue that he redefined what curation means, turning a fake gallery into a performance piece of sincerity. One museum director in Boston put it like this: Hartwell blurred the line between deception and devotion. What he did wasn't legal, but in the court of cultural memory, he created something many real institutions fail to achieve: intimacy. 7. The unsent letters. Among Hartwell's papers was a folder labeled Exhibits That Never Were. Each entry was written as a letter to an imagined guest, describing a painting and the story behind it. None of the works actually existed. One letter described a painting titled The Quiet Saint. She stands at the edge of a window, holding a bowl of ash. Her face is serene, her hands worn. A single moth rests on her shoulder. The light is not from God, but from memory. No canvas was found to match the description. Some believe these letters were scripts for paintings Hartwell hoped to finish before he vanished. 8. Where did he go? Theories abound. He fled, perhaps fearing arrest. He disappeared into Canada or the backwoods of New Hampshire. He died anonymously, a quiet man walking into obscurity. He still paints, mailing unsigned works to strangers, keeping the illusion alive. But one theory persists among the locals: that he became one of his own inventions, a phantom curator, watching from the edges, content in having been believed once, even briefly. Each spring, someone leaves a white tulip on the steps of Hartwell House. No note, no camera footage. Just a single bloom. Like a signature. 9. A different kind of theft. Douglas Hartwell didn't steal paintings. He stole certainty. He asked, what makes a gallery real? A legal form, an accredited expert, or the hushed awe of someone staring at a painting, convinced it's speaking to them? He gave people that moment. And then, like a good forger, he vanished into the background. 10. The final gallery. In a small frame near the entrance of the repurposed museum hangs a plaque, engraved with Hartwell's final known quote: Art does not need to be true. It only needs to be believed. Below it, the last fake painting he ever displayed. A candle-lit still life, peaches, parchment, and a cracked wine bottle. No signature, just a date, 1657, and underneath in pencil, or maybe 2009. And so we're left wondering if the emotion we felt was real. Does it matter who painted the brushstroke? In the spring of 2023, a man in a tan coat visited the newly renamed Hartwell House for Imagined Art. He walked slowly, pausing at each painting, saying nothing. When the volunteer guide asked if he had been to the museum before, he smiled and replied, "Oh yes, many times, but the walls used to be quieter." He didn't sign the guest book. He left a sealed envelope at the front desk and disappeared. Inside the envelope was a typed sheet. "You have restored the illusion by nomming it." That's all right. Museums are memory palaces, and I simply built one from scratch. It was unsigned, but a handwriting expert later confirmed the typed address label on the envelope matched envelopes found in Hartwell's home. He had returned to the basement again. Months later, a group of visiting art students was given access to Hartwell's former basement studio. What they found surprised even the curators. Behind a false wall panel, a narrow crawl space was discovered. Inside it, 7 small canvases, unframed. A broken teacup. A packet of receipts. A manuscript titled, On the Act of Looking, A Personal Theology of Art. The canvases were not forgeries. They were original works, all signed, D&H. One was a portrait of a middle-aged man seated in a chair, gazing at a painting just out of view. Was it a self-portrait? A study of belief? Or the only time Hartwell painted himself into the story? 3. The manuscript. The manuscript was the most revealing artifact left behind. Part memoir, part artistic manifesto, it outlined Hartwell's philosophy. Forgery is not the absence of truth. It is the recreation of an emotional past we wish had survived. He wrote of the paintings destroyed during World War II, the museums too poor to purchase what they lost, the idea that some works deserve to exist, even if they never had. He referred to his project as a memorial in brushstrokes. We mourn the loss of people with flowers. Why not mourn the loss of paintings with ghosts? 4. The ethics revisited. Following the discovery of the manuscript and original works, the conversation about Hartwell shifted. Until then, the story had been quirky, even poetic, an elderly man making fake Vermeers in a red brick house. But the manuscript made clear he knew exactly what he was doing. He anticipated prosecution. He predicted the media reaction. He even described in detail the visitor who would likely sniff out the fiction. Let them call it fraud. Let them shake their heads. The silence of a gallery has never asked for permission. Was it a confession? Or just the last stroke of his greatest illusion? 5. The donation. In December 2023, an anonymous donation arrived for the museum, $15,000, wrapped in a brown paper package, in small bills. No note, no sender. The only clue: a tiny paintbrush tied with twine to the bundle. Brand, Winsor & Newton No. 2 Sable. A brand used exclusively by Hartwell. The museum board voted unanimously to use the funds to build a new wing. The Gallery of False Histories. Its mission: to explore the intersection of fact, forgery, and feeling. 6. The town that believed. Littleton, Vermont, had once been a sleepy town of thrift stores and snowy sidewalks. Now, it was known for something stranger: a museum built on lies that felt more honest than most truths. Tourism rose. Art students visited. Philosophy classes debated Hartwell's work. But locals, they still talk about him like a neighbor. He never asked for applause, said one. He just hung ghosts on the wall and made us fall in love with them. A mural of Hartwell now sits across from the post office. It shows a man in a cardigan standing in front of a blank canvas. The title beneath: The Curator of Things That Might Have Been. 7. Final works. Art conservators confirmed that many of Hartwell's unfinished paintings were technically masterful, his brushwork eerily similar to those he emulated. One particularly haunting piece, untitled, depicted a hallway of frames, each one empty, a single candle flickering at the far end. Written on the back: "It's not the painting. It's the feeling that someone stood here before you and felt something." That painting now hangs in the entryway of Hartwell House. Visitors often pause in front of it longer than any other. 8. A new kind of artist. In 2024, an academic journal published a paper calling Hartwell the founder of a new movement: intentional non-genuine curation, or INGC. A hybrid of performance, forgery, and philosophy, it blurs the purpose of museums and challenges how we define authenticity. Hartwell didn't want you to believe the painting was real. He wanted you to realize it didn't have to be. 9. The quiet signature. To date, Hartwell has not reappeared publicly. No interviews, no confessions, no charges filed. Because the legal case, as strange as it sounds, was quietly dropped. The paintings were displayed without profit. The museum had no official tax ID. And no one ever claimed to be harmed. Instead, the U.S. Art Crime Division closed its file with the final remark: fraud requires intent to deceive for gain. This case demonstrated neither. And so the man behind the museum, and the museum that wasn't, remains free. Perhaps still painting, or perhaps just watching the visitors from a park bench nearby. 10. The final reflection. In the end, the Rosebridge Museum wasn't a fraud. It was a story, written in oil, varnish, and silence. A place where lost paintings hung again, even if they had never existed. A room full of echoes that somehow made the present feel richer. A museum that shouldn't have existed, but changed a town forever. And so we close this story with the hardest question of all. When beauty is built on a lie, but the feeling it creates is real, which part do we keep? And which part do we paint over? On October 4th, 1997, at precisely 1:57 a.m., local radio DJ James "Jimmy" Aubrey ended his overnight segment with a simple phrase. "And that's the weather in your dreams, folks. Sleep warm." It was the last thing he ever said on the air. He never returned for his next shift. The station phone rang at 5:15 a.m. Another DJ had shown up to relieve him, but found the studio locked from the inside. When the door was forced open, the room was empty. No sign of a struggle. The coffee was still hot, the mic was live. But Jimmy Aubrey was gone. To meet Jimmy Aubrey. He was 62, white-haired but lively. The kind of man who could riff on vintage jazz or highway traffic without missing a beat. For 38 years, he hosted Night Watch 98.4, the overnight talk and music show on KVOX, a small independent station in rural Wyoming. Jimmy was loved, but in a quiet, routine sort of way. He played Sinatra, Billie Holiday, and the occasional weather report spliced with sleepy trivia. People who worked graveyard shifts, truckers, overnight nurses, custodians swore by him. He called them his midnight family. And then one night, he disappeared, leaving behind a warm chair and a spinning jazz record. 3. The studio that didn't blink. KVOX was housed in a squat brick building just outside of town. One hallway, 2 studios, 1 control room. Jimmy worked alone most nights, a standard procedure for local overnight hosts. Security footage wasn't common in 1997, and the only cameras in the building were broken. The door to Studio B had been locked from the inside, yet when police entered, no one was there. His jacket hung neatly on the back of the chair. His script typed on a typewriter sat on the desk. His coffee was half full, and the mic was still live. Dead air had only lasted 11 seconds before the next track auto-cued. 4. What did he say? The tape of Jimmy's final hour was reviewed dozens of times. It was ordinary, relaxing even. Some final words that stood out. Been a sleepy kind of night, my friends. One of those where the world feels like it's folding itself into a blanket. And later, there's a fog on the ridge, and it's creeping in like a Sunday secret. It was poetic, classic Jimmy. But near the end, during a station ID break, he murmured something strange, barely audible. They're here already. Listeners didn't notice at the time, but audio engineers enhanced the tape later and confirmed it. He whispered it softly, like to himself, then transitioned straight into a Benny Goodman track. 5. The theories begin. With no signs of forced entry, and no body, the case became one of voluntary disappearance. Some said Jimmy walked out through the back door, which was found unlocked. Others believed he never left the studio at all, at least not on foot. Conspiracy theories bloomed. He had faked his death to start a new life. He was abducted by aliens, a popular theory among his more eccentric late-night callers. He had been silenced for something he knew. But what would a late-night radio host know worth silencing? According to his producers, Jimmy just wanted people to sleep well. He wasn't chasing headlines. 6. The call-in clue. A week after his disappearance, the station reviewed old call-in logs. During Jimmy's last night, a 4:12 a.m. call had come from an unregistered number. It lasted 7 minutes and 6 seconds. There was no recording, a glitch in the system erased that night's call archive. But the call log labeled the line as muted internal override. Someone, possibly Jimmy, had chosen not to air the call live. Why? The only record was a handwritten note found on a scratch pad at his desk. Caller said, "It's done, don't stay long." Then line went dead. 7. The DJ's past. Jimmy had lived in the same one-bedroom apartment for 27 years, never married, no children, no criminal history. But one detail caught the attention of investigators. Before working at KVOX, Jimmy had briefly worked for a U.S. Army communications base in the 1960s, a station known for low-frequency signal testing. He left that role in 1968 with little fanfare. Some say he was pushed out after a signal error incident involving scrambled transmissions over civilian radios. Others say he simply walked away from government work, preferring swing music over surveillance. Still, a few old colleagues remembered his voice. One said he knew more about waves than he let on. 8. Listeners report strange signals. After Jimmy vanished, listeners began calling in with odd reports. Faint voices in the static between songs. Morse code tones mixed into jazz transitions. Reversed speech at low volume under weather reports. Some dismissed it as coincidence or equipment malfunction. But a few amateur radio operators began recording late-night KVOX streams. One found a repeating tone at 19.98 kHz, a frequency commonly associated with military beacons, not civilian broadcasting. Another claimed to decode a phrase embedded in white noise. "He's off the grid, stay clear." Whether it was real or planted, no one could say. 9. The station's statement. After 2 weeks of silence, KVOX released a statement. "We mourn the unexplained disappearance of our beloved Jimmy Aubrey. While law enforcement has found no evidence of foul play, we acknowledge the hole his absence leaves in our community. Night Watch will go on, but it won't be the same." They never aired another live overnight program. Instead, they played Jimmy's archived tapes on loop for 2 years, calling it the Forever Broadcast. It became a cult favorite online. And in that loop, Jimmy's voice lives on velvet smooth, drifting like smoke over midnight highways. 10. So where did he go? Theories persist. That he walked into the woods, never to return. That he was contacted by someone from his past, someone tied to military frequencies. That he disappeared on purpose, leaving only the soft hum of dead air in his place. But maybe the answer is simpler. Maybe Jimmy always wanted to vanish quietly, gently into the frequency he loved most. And maybe he did. So here's the question. If a man disappears during a broadcast, with no sound, no scream, and no sign, did he vanish? Or did he simply fade out, like a song no one finishes? In March of 1998, 6 months after Jimmy Aubrey vanished, a late-night truck driver passing through rural Idaho claimed he picked up KVOX on his AM dial hundreds of miles outside its broadcast range. He swore the signal was clear, the music unmistakable. Old jazz, a weather report, and then Jimmy's voice. "It's a low fog tonight. Careful on the roads, friends." But KVOX's transmitter was off-air that evening for scheduled maintenance. Officially, no one was broadcasting. 2. The pattern emerges. Over the next 2 years, sporadic signal reports came in from across the country. A night nurse in Arkansas, a college student in rural Vermont, a retired ham operator in New Mexico. Each claimed to pick up a broadcast resembling Jimmy's show, but the time codes didn't match any archive tape. The voices weren't recordings, they sounded live. And each listener reported the same eerie detail. After the music faded, Jimmy's voice would say, "You're not alone out there, not yet." 3. Government eyes. In 1999, a Freedom of Information Act (FOIA) request revealed that a division of the Federal Communications Commission, FCC, had opened a quiet investigation into rogue frequencies mimicking licensed radio patterns. Though heavily redacted, the documents mention anomalous repeater echoes mimicking defunct KVOX overnight programming, possible Cold War-era signal drift unrelated to modern transmitters. Subject: Aubrey, James C. Attached clearance level memo. The memo was never released, but former FCC tech agent Laura Frisk, retired 2005, later confirmed in an interview. "We were tracking ghost signals, and his voice came up more than once. Thing is, we couldn't triangulate a source." 4. The tapes that changed. KVOX kept dozens of Jimmy's broadcast tapes for rebroadcast after his disappearance. But in 2001, a producer doing routine digitization noticed something chilling. One tape originally dated August 14, 1996 had changed. Where Jimmy had originally said, "Looks like thunderstorms through midnight," the new digitized version had him saying, "Static tonight, they're close." No one had edited the tape. No one had access to the originals, which were kept in a locked archive room. Technicians brought in to analyze the reel found no splices, no data overwrite, no corruption. As if the tape had rewritten itself. 5. The cassette in the mail. In 2003, a package arrived at the KVOX front desk with no return address. Inside, a single cassette tape. A note: "Found this in my dad's attic, thought it was yours." No other information. The tape, labeled JA10/12/97, played a half-hour of audio. It began with soft piano jazz, then Jimmy's voice, slightly distant. "If you hear this, you've tuned to the wrong place. Or maybe the right one." Then silence for 8 full minutes. Finally, whispered, barely audible, "We left markers in the sky, but no one looked up." Experts confirmed the voice as a 99.2% match for Jimmy. 6. The Tower Watchers. In the years following Jimmy's disappearance, radio hobbyists began camping out near the old KVOX transmission tower, now long defunct. Many claimed to hear hum-like tones at exactly 3:03 a.m. A few even picked up brief bursts of music songs never aired by KVOX before. One clip, captured by a YouTube user in 2006, played 14 seconds of a jazz rendition of "Somewhere Over the Rainbow," followed by Jimmy's voice saying, "I'll be where the signal bends." The original video was removed without explanation, but its audio has circulated ever since, known among late-night communities as the Bend broadcast. 7. What did he know? By 2010, deep-dive internet forums dedicated to ghost frequencies began unearthing details of Jimmy's early life. Documents show he briefly worked on Operation Dogstar, a Cold War-era program, exploring low-frequency psychological effects in broadcast environments. One declassified memo read, Subject Aubrey expresses concern about unintended auditory hallucinations during prolonged testing windows. Another, possible disassociation with linear time reporting. Subject claims to have heard future broadcasts. Further psychological eval advised. It appears Jimmy was pulled from the program shortly after those statements. He never spoke publicly about it, but maybe his voice did long after he vanished. 8. A new signal in town. In 2012, KVOX was sold and rebranded. The new owners converted the space into a podcast studio. During the renovation, workers discovered a locked cabinet behind the old soundproofing foam. Inside, several notebooks filled with handwritten notes from Jimmy. Schematics for modular frequency layer tuning. A single key with the tag, Backdoor 2B. The key didn't fit any door in the building. One notebook entry read, "If it loops, let it. If it speaks, record. If it fades, wait." Another, "I'm not lost, I'm spread." 9. The search today. In late-night radio lore, Jimmy Aubrey is a legend, a myth stitched together with analog tape and unsolved signals. He's been referenced in books, podcasts, even paranormal TV specials. To this day, ham operators claim to pick up his voice every few months. Sleep-deprived drivers swear they hear him, reminding them to take a break. Archivists still search for inconsistencies in his surviving recordings, hoping for a message. And at exactly 1:57 a.m. every October 4th, hundreds of radios are tuned to silence, waiting. Not for noise, but for Jimmy. 10. The Midnight Theory. There's a growing theory among signal chasers, those who track unexplained radio anomalies, that Jimmy Aubrey didn't vanish. He became a signal. That whatever he knew or whatever he became part of allowed his consciousness to be encoded in the frequencies he loved so much. Maybe it's metaphor, maybe myth. But the theory has a name now. The Midnight Loop. And it ends with one question. If a voice keeps speaking in the static, even when the man is gone, is the broadcast over? Or is it just beginning? In 2016, a hiker near Wind Creek Trail, just 40 miles from the old KVOX studio, found a small cabin hidden in dense overgrowth. The building wasn't listed on any maps. Inside were a rusted bed frame, a portable generator, a ham radio setup still powered by a connected solar array, dozens of notebooks labeled only by frequency ranges. But most curious of all, a reel-to-reel recorder loaded with a tape marked JA Continuous. 2. The continuous tape. The tape ran for 6 hours. It contained ambient static, soft jazz, a male voice, unmistakably Jimmy Aubrey. The voice never addressed a listener directly, but offered musings, some poetic, some cryptic. There are layers in the night like onion skin. Peel too far and the sound bleeds. And I didn't leave. I turned sideways. It's just the air that changed. No time stamps, no commercial breaks, just an endless drift of commentary and music. It was his voice, but older, a raspier timbre, a slower cadence. As if Jimmy had continued recording long after he vanished. 3. Tracing the cabin. Authorities couldn't determine who built the cabin. It was wired with military-grade radio equipment, most of it outdated, but still operational. One-piece A spectrum analyzer continuously swept a narrow band, 98.4 to 99.2 FM. A pattern emerged every night between 1:00 and 2:00 a.m., a pulse of white noise at precisely 98.4. The same frequency Jimmy had broadcast on. But the station was now long gone. This was something else. Something residual. 4. The voice in reverse. Audio experts brought in to clean and analyze the tape from the cabin noticed something hidden in the reverse channel's faint, reversed speech. When played backward, Jimmy's voice whispered, "If you're listening, you're already part of it." And elsewhere, "They told me I'd fade, but I adjusted. It's peaceful here, inside the hum." What did he mean? Was this performance art, a psychological fracture, or something more? 5. The Nightwatch Files. In 2020, a former KVOX intern named Rachel Greaves uploaded a collection of Jimmy's broadcast logs and scribbled memos to the internet. These included the Nightwatch Files, Jimmy's personal notes from 1994 to 1997. Among the pages, a list of names, mostly first names, no context. Sketched diagrams of modulated wave interference patterns. A recurring phrase, written dozens of times. "No one listens to silence, but it's where the truth is." The final entry, dated October 3, 1997, simply read, "They've finally made contact." 6. Crosstalk. In 2021, an independent researcher broadcasting out of Montana claimed to have captured live crosstalk over an open UHF band, voices bleeding into his signal. One was clearly Jimmy, the other unidentifiable. The brief interaction lasted 14 seconds. Unknown voice, "You stayed longer than allowed." Jimmy, "Someone had to keep watch." Unknown voice, "It's not safe to linger." Jimmy, "I'm not lingering, I'm anchoring." And then a hard signal drop. The entire spectrum went dead. 7. The Final Broadcast. In 2023, on the 26th anniversary of his disappearance, a late-night rebroadcaster streamed a full loop of Jimmy's final 72 hours on air. Around 1:57 a.m., during what should have been a repeat of a 1996 jazz segment, a new recording played never heard before. Jimmy's voice came through clearly. "This isn't a memory, it's a mirror. You're listening backwards, but I'm still ahead of you." Listeners flooded forums. The broadcaster insisted he hadn't uploaded anything new. Digital logs showed the file didn't exist before that night and vanished immediately after. 8. The Legacy of 98.4. KVOX's original signal license expired in 2005. The tower was dismantled and its frequency left open. But every few years, 98.4 FM still pings on analog scanners for brief seconds, carrying nothing but a slow, fatting jazz melody. In small pockets of the country, mostly rural people still report hearing Jimmy's voice, often during storms or moments of strange weather interference. To them, it's comfort, a signal of stillness, something that says, "You're not alone. Not yet." 9. More Than a Man. What are we to make of Jimmy Aubrey? A gentle-voiced DJ who vanished without a trace. A Cold War radio man with secrets buried beneath vinyl stacks. A name whispered across forgotten frequencies. Is he alive, dead, encoded into static, or just a figment of coincidence and grief? In the end, maybe he was something we all crave. A voice in the dark that never stopped speaking, even after everyone else stopped listening. 10. The Final Fade. We end this story not with an answer, but a sound. The same sound that ends every tape of Jimmy's show, a long, soft fade of static that seems to breathe. And sometimes, if you listen closely, it says your name. So let's leave it here, where the music softens and the hum of the earth takes over. If a person becomes a frequency, how long can they echo? And if that echo keeps someone from feeling alone, was it ever truly gone? The Abbey of the Holy Shepherd sits atop a forested hill in northern Pennsylvania, nestled between mossy oaks and long-forgotten roads. For nearly 150 years, It housed a small, self-sustaining community of nuns, a cloistered order, rarely seen in public. There were no tour, no visitors, just muted prayers and veiled faces. And for decades it was peaceful. Until one night in 1993, when Sister Marie Elena stepped out into the darkness, walked barefoot down the hill to a police station, and calmly said, "There are bones in the walls, and I think it was my fault." To the confession. The officers on duty that night assumed she was confused. Sister Marie was 68, gaunt, quiet, eyes distant like windows fogged in prayer. They offered her tea, she refused. Then she pulled from her robe a small cloth pouch containing a wedding ring blackened with time, a child's sock, a human tooth. She whispered, "They buried the truth with the saints." It was the beginning of one of the most bizarre cold cases in Pennsylvania history. One involving misplaced faith, hidden graves, and the unraveling of a sacred illusion. 3. Who was Sister Marie? Born Elena Brauso in 1925, she entered the abbey at age 19 after a stillbirth and the death of her husband in a mill accident. She took the name Sister Marie Elena of the Sacred Chorus and never left the convent again. For decades, she was a model of devotion, maintained the chapel, directed music for Mass, taught hymns to novitiates. She was known to hum softly as she worked and to speak only when spoken to. By the time of her confession, she had lived in the abbey for 49 years. 4. The abbey's reputation. The Abbey of the Holy Shepherd wasn't just a spiritual refuge, it was whispered to be a place of miracles. In the 1950s and 60s, rumors spread of unexplained healings linked to the abbey's sacred relic. The slippers of St. Agnes, a pair of faded leather shoes, said to have belonged to a 12th century mystic who died young and holy. The slippers were displayed in a gold case behind the altar. Pilgrims weren't allowed inside, but postcards circulated showing the reliquary, bathed in candlelight. Locals believed a child touched by a priest wearing the slippers would not stutter. A woman who prayed near the relic would conceive after years of barrenness. A man with a bad heart, blessed by the presence of the slippers, could walk uphill again. And perhaps most disturbingly, that the slippers had been stolen once and someone had died for it. 5. The first wall. After Sister Marie's report, detectives obtained a warrant and entered the abbey. On the third day of the search, they found it. A false plaster wall, just behind the reliquary room. Behind it, a sealed chamber, no larger than a closet. 2 small skeletons curled inwards, their hands bound with rosary beads. A rosary with a locket embedded into bone. The locket held a photo. A young nun holding an infant, smiling faintly. DNA later confirmed the bodies were a woman in her 20s, Sister Judith, listed as transferred to Rome in 1964. An infant, sex unknown, likely stillborn. Sister Marie identified them instantly. They told her the baby was a sin. She refused to give it up. 6. The silence of the order. When questioned, the abbey's Mother Superior, Sister Regina, denied everything. Sister Marie is old. Her mind is not what it once was. But investigators found 10 handwritten journals hidden in Sister Marie's sleeping quarters. In them she described Sister Judith's pregnancy, which she claimed was the result of a visiting seminarian's coercion. The infant's birth in secret, aided by Sister Marie herself. A trial held by the senior nuns, who deemed Judith guilty of pride, fornication, and deception. The infant's stillbirth, which was seen as divine punishment. And finally, the burial. They told me to seal the wall, one entry read, and pray. 7. The slippers. Among the more bizarre details, Sister Marie's notes reference the slippers of St. Agnes dozens of times, but not as relics. She claimed they weren't centuries old at all. They were hand-sewn in the 1930s by a nun named Sister Camille, who had a background in textile forgery. They had been aged, using ash and vinegar, and were planted in the abbey during a Vatican liaison's visit in 1940 to draw funding and prestige. And the miracles, Sister Marie wrote, people believe what they need. And sometimes that's enough to make it true. But after Sister Judith's death, the miracles stopped. 8. The second wall. 6 months after the initial search, forensic teams discovered another cavity behind the abbey's music room. Inside, a burlap sack with bones belonging to at least 3 individuals. Remnants of rosary beads, old coins, and 2 cracked porcelain dolls. A wooden plaque faded with age reading, "Protect the sanctum from scandal." None of the remains were ever identified. No matching missing persons cases. Just bones, prayer tokens, and silence. The abbey refused further cooperation and entered ecclesiastical lockdown, invoking the seal of the confessional and church sanctuary protections. The investigation stalled. 9. What happened to Sister Marie? In 1995, 2 years after her confession, Sister Marie died in hospice care. Her last words, according to the attending nurse, "I kept the slippers, the real ones, in the floorboard under the 3rd pew." After her death, detectives returned with one last warrant. Beneath the 3rd pew, they found a cloth bundle. A pair of modern leather slippers, scuffed and worn. A birth certificate for the infant labeled Judith's child. A short note. "These are the relics. Not for miracles, for memory." 10. No trials, no closure. Despite the findings, no criminal charges were ever filed. The statute of limitations had expired. No living witnesses, aside from Sister Marie, had confessed. The church invoked canonical law to block further interviews. The abbey closed in 2003 due to dwindling numbers. The building remains abandoned, vines crawling over cracked stained glass and warped doors. But for those who remember or still whisper the story on winter nights, the question remains: how many sins can a holy place bury before the weight begins to break the walls? The few surviving recordings of the Abbey of the Holy Shepherd's Choir are haunting. Slow, minor key hymns echoing through a small chapel with too much space between voices. In one rare reel from 1962, you can hear a soft cough at the start followed by a trembling soprano voice. That was Sister Judith. She joined the order at 23, known for her musical ability and independent thinking. According to Sister Marie's journals, she asked questions others didn't. Why weren't novices allowed outside the abbey walls? Why were the slippers of St. Agnes never authenticated? Why did visiting clergy leave in the middle of the night? But it was a different kind of question, the kind a woman asks after trauma that changed everything. If God sees everything, why did he stop it? 2. The seminarian. There was no name, no official record. Only fragments in Sister Marie's journals. He was sent for spiritual enrichment, though Marie suspected other motives, possibly as part of a quiet inquiry into the abbey's bookkeeping. Described as young, sharp-featured, wore an iron cross with an inscription scratched out, seemed to take special interest in Sister Judith. One journal entry from 1964. He cornered her near the vestry. I heard nothing, but after she would not sing, she would not eat. Another. She wept when she missed her cycle. I said nothing, I was weak. Within 3 months, Sister Judith was pregnant. 3. The pregnancy. There was no midwife, no medical consultation. Only whispered prayers and what little Sister Marie could remember from her own short-lived motherhood before joining the order. The other nuns noticed Judith's slowing steps, her swelling shape. But nothing was said aloud, until the day of the Council of Elders, a rare event, reserved for internal judgment. 7 senior nuns met in the sanctuary. Judith was called to stand in silence before them. According to Marie, they said the child was a curse, and that our silence would preserve the abbey's grace. Judith was ordered to be confined. She was 7 months pregnant. For the delivery. On February 3, 1965, Judith gave birth inside the abbey's music room. It was cold, snow had fallen heavy that week. The baby was born with the cord around its neck. Marie tried to resuscitate, but it was stillborn. She wrapped the child in a linen cloth and wept with Judith. But the moment was short-lived. 2 elder nuns entered, took the baby, and told Judith to begin her penance. Marie wasn't allowed to follow. That night Judith vanished. 5. The wall is built. The next morning, Sister Marie was summoned. She was told Sister Judith had been called to Rome for reassignment. But Marie noticed her bedding was gone. Her Bible was missing. Her rosary, a gift from her late mother, left behind. I was handed a trowel. They said the reliquary room had structural issues. But the walls didn't need plaster. They needed forgetting. She helped build the wall that sealed Sister Judith and her infant into shadow. And she never sang again. 6. The rise of the miracles. After the burial, the abbey changed. The slippers of St. Agnes were redisplayed with greater ceremony. Pilgrims were allowed to stand just inside the chapel threshold for short blessings. Stories spread again. A boy with seizures stopped convulsing after touching the chapel door. A woman pregnant after 12 years of infertility delivered healthy twins. A priest claimed to see a halo of dust above the slippers during Mass. The Vatican sent a cardinal emissary to assess the validity of the miracles. His visit was brief. The miracles were deemed subject to interpretation, but no fraud was detected. Funding resumed. 7. Sister Camille's secrets. Investigators later found letters between Sister Marie and Sister Camille, the nun believed to have crafted the slippers. One letter, dated 1941. I stitched the soles to match the 12th century style from the archives. I aged the leather with ash and vinegar, just like you said. Another, if this brings comfort, is it really a lie? Camille died in 1966. Her death certificate simply read, respiratory failure. But her journal included an ominous line. I see their eyes sometimes, behind the reliquary glass, watching us pretend. 8. The second burial. The second wall discovered behind the music room in 1994 was built sometime after 1970. But no record exists of who might be buried there. Sister Marie's final journals speculate. We took in troubled girls, runaways. A few were left on our steps by desperate mothers. Some of those girls may have died in childbirth. Some may not have survived their silence. Sister Marie feared. They sealed more than rooms. They sealed voices. 9. The loss of faith. By the 1980s, the abbey's numbers had dwindled. Miracles were spoken of less. The slippers remained, but few believed. Marie continued her duties silently, aging into a kind of living relic herself. And then, one night in 1993, she stood before her candle-lit mirror and asked the same question Judith once had. If God sees everything, why did he stop it? She gathered the baby's tooth, the slipper and the ring, and walked barefoot into the cold. 10. The echo today. The abbey is long closed, but local children dare one another to sneak inside on cold autumn nights. Some say you can still hear a woman humming in the music room. Others swear the slippers glow faintly in moonlight, though they were never recovered. But perhaps the most chilling legend, a voice, almost inaudible, reciting the final verse of the novitiate hymn the one sister Judith used to lead. I walked through the valley, unafraid of the tomb, for love lights the lantern in every dark room. And then, I forgive you. After Sister Marie's death in 1995, her journals were stored in a diocese archive in Harrisburg. There they sat for nearly a decade. But in 2006, a local historian named Margaret Linley, researching post-war religious reform, requested access. What she found sparked a renewed and final investigation into the Abbey of the Holy Shepherd. She described the journals as a labyrinth of half-confessions, equal parts liturgical poetry and forensic memoir. Too quiet to be lies. One entry stood out. They beat the scandal out of her, but not the song. I can still hear her in the floorboards. 2. Vatican silence. When Margaret Linley tried to get in touch with the diocese, she received a templated response. All matters pertaining to internal spiritual discipline fall under canon law. No further comment. No one would confirm the following: the identity of the seminarian, whether any disciplinary action had been taken, how the relics had been verified, why the abbey's internal transfers never matched external records. One retired bishop later said anonymously, "Some sanctuaries are built on stories, and some stories are worth more than the truth." 3. What was buried? To date, 5 partial human skeletons have been recovered from within the abbey's walls. Only Sister Judith and her infant were identified. The rest, unmatched, unnamed. The floor beneath the altar was never excavated. The order obtained a stay of investigation on religious grounds. Forensic anthropologists believe more remains are likely present. Infants, runaway girls, possibly elderly nuns who died quietly, with no one to report their passing. The abbey had always been self-contained, even in death. 4. A whispered rebellion. In 1998, a former novice named Annabelle Torres contacted Margaret Linley. She had stayed at the abbey for 6 months in 1972 before being told she lacked the proper humility. Annabelle claimed she witnessed a trial of a nun accused of stealing food for a child hidden on the grounds. She was told that the sins of women are too heavy for daylight. She found, sewn into her mattress, a torn page of the Bible with a handwritten phrase, "God doesn't live here anymore, just rules and silence." Annabelle left the abbey with bruises, a small Bible, and a recurring nightmare: a crying baby behind a stone wall. 5. The third wall. Several of Sister Marie's final entries mention a third wall, built in 1983. She doesn't specify where, but she describes a brass bowl, a child's comb, and music that never stopped. Some believe it was metaphorical. Others, especially Margaret Linley, believe at least one more burial site remains inside the abbey. In 2011, Linley raised funds for ground-penetrating radar analysis. But by then, the abbey had been purchased by a private Catholic conservancy. Access was denied. The building remains closed to the public. 6. The slippers resurface. In 2017, a woman named Nora Bell, attending an estate sale in rural Pennsylvania, purchased a small wooden box for $12. Inside were a pair of small leather slippers, a rosary made of carved wood, a note that read, "For remembrance, not miracles." Forensic textile experts examined the slippers. They matched 1930s construction techniques and bore traces of aged vinegar, ash identical to the method Sister Marie described in her journals. The woman donated them to a university archive. Some see it as closure. Others say the real slippers were never recovered, or they never mattered. 7, where the song ended. To this day, former parishioners who visited the abbey as children say they remember Sister Marie's humming. She hummed like she was somewhere else. It was sad music, like bedtime for someone who wouldn't wake up. It made me want to cry and didn't know why. Her favorite hymn was Hodie Christus Natus Est, a piece usually reserved for Christmas Day. She hummed it year-round, even in the middle of summer, even when there was no congregation. 8, the last visitor. One of the final entries in Sister Marie's journal describes a visitor in early 1993. A woman with storm-gray hair and a hollow face. She stood at the edge of the pews, never entered. When I looked up, she mouthed the words, "I found you." Then she was gone. Was it Sister Judith's mother? A vision? Or simply an imagined reckoning before the end? Marie never clarified. But the line after that entry reads, "I'm ready now." 9, the Abbey now. The Abbey of the Holy Shepherd is still standing crumbling, overtaken by vines, flanked by dying pines. Locals say no one lives there. But every year, on the night of February 3rd, the date of the birth and death of Judith's child, candles appear in the chapel windows. No electricity, no visitors. Just flickering light. And sometimes the faint sound of humming. A lullaby half sung. Then silence again. 10, what we're left with. There were no convictions. No confessions outside Sister Marie's own. No public reckoning. Just a quiet, cold story of buried lives, manufactured miracles, and a woman who finally spoke too late for justice, just in time for memory. We are left with bones, slippers, a song, and one haunting line. They buried the truth with the saints. But the truth has a way of rising. Sometimes, all it takes is someone willing to hum in the dark until the silence can't bear it anymore.